In the final days of the Third Reich, while the Red Army was pouring into Czechoslovakia and German soldiers were dying in trenches they had been ordered to hold at any cost, a single Fiesler Storch aircraft lifted off from a small field near the town of Saz. Inside that plane sat the last Field Marshal Adolf Hitler ever promoted, a man who only days earlier had been signing execution orders for soldiers accused of cowardice. A man who had told his troops that anyone who retreated would be hanged from the nearest tree as a traitor to the fatherland. His name was Ferdinand Schörner, and as his plane climbed away from the men he had sworn to lead to the very last bullet, he was already changing out of his Field Marshal uniform and into a plain Bavarian civilian suit he had packed for exactly this moment. The army he abandoned that day, roughly 1 million men of Heeresgruppe Mitte, would be left to surrender on its own, and tens of thousands of them would never see Germany again. This is the story of the most hated commander in the Wehrmacht, a fanatic who demanded death from his soldiers and saved his own skin the moment the war was lost. To understand how a man becomes that kind of officer, you have to go back much further than 1945. All the way to a young Bavarian schoolteacher born in Munich in 1892. Ferdinand Schörner was not from the old Prussian military aristocracy that produced men like Manstein or Rundstedt. He was the son of a police officer, educated to be a teacher of classical languages, and he came into the army through the volunteer route when the First World War broke out. What set him apart almost immediately was a kind of raw, aggressive courage that bordered on the suicidal. As a young lieutenant in the Alps Corps fighting on the Italian front in 1917, he led his company up the slopes of Monte Collovrat during the breakthrough at Caporetto, and for that action he received the Pour le Mérite, the highest military honor the Kingdom of Prussia could give. He was 25 years old, and he had just joined an extremely small club of junior officers decorated with what soldiers called the Blue Max. That medal would define how he saw himself for the rest of his life, as a frontline warrior who had earned the right to demand absolute sacrifice from anyone wearing a German uniform. Between the wars, he stayed in the small Reichswehr, the 100,000-man army Germany was allowed under the Treaty of Versailles. And unlike most of the conservative officer corps, he became a convinced National Socialist long before it was fashionable to admit it. He genuinely believed in Hitler, not in the cynical, careerist way many generals later claimed they had merely tolerated the regime, but with the burning faith of a true believer who thought the Führer was the destiny of the German people. That faith would become the engine of everything that came next, because Schörner was not a brilliant strategist. He was not a clever operational thinker like Manstein. He was not a master of armored warfare like Guderian. What he had was willpower, and a conviction that willpower alone could substitute for fuel, for ammunition, for tanks, and for the lives of the men under his command. When the Second World War began, he commanded a mountain regiment in the invasion of Poland, and then led the 6th Mountain Division during the Balkan Campaign in 1941, where he forced the Metaxas Line in northern Greece in a series of brutal frontal assaults that other commanders had said were impossible. The Wehrmacht High Command noticed. Hitler noticed even more, because here was a general who did not write nervous memoranda about supply problems, who did not request permission to withdraw, who did not bother his Führer with realistic assessments of enemy strength. Here was a general who attacked, and who kept attacking, and who reported success in the language Hitler wanted to hear. In 1942, he was sent to the far north, to the Arctic front in Lapland, where he commanded the 19th Mountain Corps in the frozen wasteland near Murmansk. The conditions there were beyond imagination. Men froze to death in their sleep. Supplies came over hundreds of kilometers of tundra, and yet Schörner held that sector for 2 long years, and he did it with a discipline so harsh that even the SS reportedly raised eyebrows. It was in the East, however, that the legend of Schörner the executioner truly took shape. In early 1944, he was given command of Army Group South Ukraine, and a few months later, after the catastrophic collapse of Army Group Center during Operation Bagration, he was moved to Army Group North, the formation cut off in the Courland Pocket on the Baltic coast. By this point, the German army was disintegrating on every front. Soldiers were deserting in growing numbers, units were melting away under Soviet pressure, and most generals were quietly trying to save as many of their men as they could. Schörner went in the opposite direction. He issued order after order, demanding that any soldier found behind the front line without written authorization be treated as a deserter and shot or hanged on the spot. Roving Courts-Martial, called Fliegende Standgerichte, traveled through his rear areas with the explicit job of finding stragglers and executing them, often within minutes of capture, with the bodies left hanging from trees and lampposts, with signs around their necks reading things like, "I am a coward," or "I deserted my comrades." These were not isolated incidents, this was systematic policy, and Schörner signed off on it personally. The veterans who survived to write memoirs after the war remembered him with a hatred that you almost never see directed at other senior commanders. They remembered the inspections where he would arrive at a frontline position, find some exhausted soldier whose uniform was not properly buttoned, and demote him to a penal unit on the spot. They remembered him screaming at battalion commanders that retreat was a Jewish invention, that the German soldier did not need rest, did not need food, did not need ammunition. He needed faith in the Führer. They remembered men being strung up in village squares for offenses as small as leaving their post to find water. And they remembered the cold, sneering tone in which Schörner addressed officers with decades more frontline experience than himself. And here is the bitter irony at the heart of it all. The man who screamed loudest about cowardice was rarely seen in actual danger himself. He spent most of his time at well-appointed headquarters far behind the line, flying in for short, theatrical visits and then flying out again before anything unpleasant could reach him. Hitler adored him for exactly these qualities. In a Wehrmacht where generals were increasingly cautious, increasingly unwilling to spend German lives on hopeless attacks, Schörner was the one commander who never argued, never hesitated, never told the Führer that an order was impossible. Goebbels wrote in his diary in early 1945 that Schörner was the only general left who really understood National Socialism, and Hitler echoed that opinion almost word for word. In January of 1945, Schörner was given command of Army Group A, soon renamed Army Group Center, the enormous formation defending what remained of German-held territory in Silesia and Czechoslovakia. And on the 5th of April 1945, with the Reich already in its death throes, Hitler promoted him to Generalfeldmarschall, Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German army. He was the last man to receive that promotion in the history of the Third Reich. What is genuinely difficult to convey is the atmosphere inside Army Group Center during those final weeks. The war was over. Every rational person knew it was over. The Americans were on the Elbe. The Soviets were in Berlin. The Reich had shrunk to a few disconnected pockets of resistance. And in the middle of this collapse, Schörner was still issuing orders that read like something from 1941, demanding aggressive counterattacks, demanding the recapture of lost villages, demanding that any officer who suggested withdrawal be relieved of command and tried for treason. His own staff, including officers who had served with him for years, began to whisper among themselves that the Field Marshal had lost touch with reality. Soldiers in the line received orders printed on Army Group Center stationery, telling them that anyone who fell back even a few hundred meters without permission would be hanged. and they could look up from those orders and see the bodies of comrades dangling from the trees as proof that the threat was real. Then came Hitler's testament, dictated in the bunker on the 29th of April 1945, the document in which the Führer named his successors before taking his own life the following day. In that testament, Schörner was named Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Oberbefehlshaber des Heers, the highest military position in what was left of Germany. It was a meaningless title for an army that no longer existed, but it was the ultimate sign of how completely Hitler had trusted this one man to the very end. Schörner received the news at his headquarters in Czechoslovakia, and here is where the story turns, where every speech he had ever given, every soldier he had ever hanged, every demand for absolute sacrifice he had ever made, collapses into one of the most shameful acts of personal cowardice in the entire history of the German officer corps. On the 8th of May 1945, the day the unconditional surrender of all German forces came into effect, Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner did not gather his staff to organize an orderly capitulation. He did not stay with his men to negotiate terms with the Soviets, who were closing in on his position from multiple directions. He did not even bother to inform most of his army group commanders of what he was about to do. Instead, he climbed into a small liaison aircraft, the same Fiesler Storch one mentioned at the beginning of this story, and he had himself flown out of the encirclement towards the Austrian Alps. He had already prepared a set of civilian clothes, Bavarian Tracht, in fact, the traditional dress of his home region. And somewhere along the way he stopped being Field Marshal Schörner and became a private citizen trying to disappear into the mountains. The army he left behind, hundreds of thousands of men in Bohemia and Moravia, was overrun in the following days by the Red Army. Many surrendered, many were killed in the chaotic final battles around Prague, and a vast number were marched east into Soviet captivity, where conditions were so brutal that a significant proportion never came home. He did not get far. American troops in Austria arrested him on the 18th of May, 10 days after the surrender, and when they discovered who they had caught, they could hardly believe it. Here was the commander-in-chief of the German army, named in Hitler's own testament, picked up wandering around in a folk costume and trying to pass as a civilian. The Americans, who had no intention of putting him on trial themselves for crimes committed against his own soldiers on the Eastern Front, eventually handed him over to the Soviets. The Soviets took him to Moscow, where he was tried and sentenced to 25 years in a labor camp for war crimes against the Soviet Union. He served roughly 10 of those years in Soviet captivity, in conditions that, by every account, broke him physically and mentally, before being released in 1955, along with the last large group of German prisoners of war. And here, you might think, the story would end, with an old man crawling home in disgrace. But West Germany in 1955 was not yet ready to confront what its army had done, and Schörner returned to a country where many of his former enemies inside the Wehrmacht had built quiet, respectable lives. He moved back to Munich, the city of his birth, and he expected to be treated as a returned veteran, perhaps even with a pension. The veterans had other ideas. The men who had served under him, or whose brothers and friends had been hanged on his orders, began to speak publicly about what he had done, and a German court eventually tried him not for war crimes against the Soviets, but for the manslaughter of one of his own soldiers, a captain named Anton Dorfer, who had been condemned to death on Schörner's orders in the final weeks of the war. In 1957, a Munich court found him guilty and sentenced him to 4.5 years in prison. He served part of that sentence, was released early due to his health, and lived out the rest of his life in a small flat in Munich, increasingly bitter, increasingly isolated, refusing almost to the end to admit that anything he had done had been wrong. He died in 1973 at the age of 80, and the obituaries in the German press were brief and cold. The Bundeswehr, the new democratic German army, made no official acknowledgement of his passing. Veterans associations refused to participate in his funeral in any formal capacity. The man who had been the last Field Marshal of the Third Reich, the man Hitler had trusted above all others, was buried almost in silence, mourned by very few. And that silence, in many ways, was the most honest verdict any German institution ever delivered on him. The army he had terrorized had not forgotten. The widows of the soldiers he had hanged had not forgotten. The men who had been left behind in Czechoslovakia when his plane took off had not forgotten. What makes Ferdinand Schörner such a disturbing figure, even compared to other senior Nazi commanders, is the perfect symmetry between the demands he made of others and the standards he applied to himself. He spent 4 years telling German soldiers that retreat was treason, that surrender was cowardice, that a real National Socialist would die in his hole rather than take a single step backwards. He hanged men for less than what he himself did on the 8th of May 1945. He preached the religion of sacrifice and practiced the religion of self-preservation. Generals like Heinrici, who we have looked at on this channel before, ended the war by deliberately disobeying Hitler in order to save tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians. Schörner ended the war by obeying Hitler with theatrical fanaticism right up until the moment it became personally dangerous. And then he ran. The contrast tells you almost everything you need to know about the moral landscape inside the Wehrmacht in those final months, where you could find men of genuine humanity and men of complete moral emptiness, wearing the same uniform and holding the same rank. There is one final detail that I think captures the man better than any battle report or war crimes indictment ever could. During his trial in Munich, when prosecutors asked him to account for the executions he had ordered in the closing weeks of the war, Schörner reportedly answered that a field marshal could not be expected to remember every individual case, that discipline had been necessary, that history would judge him fairly. He said this in a courtroom full of veterans, some of whom had personally cut down the bodies of comrades he had ordered hanged. He said this as a free man, decades after the events, with no Soviet camp guard standing over him. And in that answer, in that careful bureaucratic deflection, you can hear the same voice that signed all those death warrants, the voice of a man who never, not once in his entire life, applied to himself the standard he so cheerfully applied to everyone else. That, more than the medals, more than the rank, more than the Bavarian costume he wore on the day he abandoned his army, is the real legacy of Ferdinand Schörner, the last Field Marshal of the Third Reich, and quite possibly the most hated commander the German army ever produced.